to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Allison Elias. Allison is an assistant professor of business administration and member of the communication faculty here at the Darden School of Business. And she and I recently connected to talk more about her background, what she enjoys about teaching at Darden, her recent book, The Rise of Corporate Feminism, as well as two of her electives, negotiation and women, gender, and work. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here is my interview with Allison Elias. Allison, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Brett.
Well, it's great having you here. How are you doing?
Thanks. I'm doing great. We just finished up Q1, first quarter here in the residential program. So doing some grading and getting ready for Q2 to start.
What class were you teaching in quarter one?
Quarter one, I had one section of negotiations and one section of an elective called Women, Gender, and Work. And then in quarter two, I'll have two sections of the core leadership communication class for the first years. So it'll be great to get to know some of them.
Yeah, staying busy.
Yeah, staying busy. Staying busy.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about you. We're going to talk about the electives you mentioned, negotiation and women, gender, and work a little bit later in the conversation. But before we get there, just want to set the scene and give our listeners a chance to get to know you a bit better. So tell us a little bit more about you. Who are you and what's your background?
Sure. I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, so just a couple hours away from Charlottesville, and always loved school. Wanted to figure out a way to never leave school, so led me into academia. I came to UVA for my undergraduate and my graduate degrees, and actually got my PhD in history. I studied modern women's history and business history. And while I was finishing my dissertation, I worked as a research assistant at Darden for the Institute for Business and Society, and did some case writing and, supported different projects and courses. And I went off to teach elsewhere, but got really excited by the opportunity to return to Darden, and just got back here a couple years ago as full-time faculty.
So interesting to think about. You don't hear a lot of PhDs in history who end up working at a business school.
Yeah, especially in a communications area, some of them end up more in like a strategy area when thinking about, global strategies or markets or how economies develop. I like to think of myself as really good at storytelling in a way of, thinking about the past and stories about the past, narratives we hold, about the United States or other countries, and who is part of the economy and who is not. And so I like to think that my work contributes to bringing new stories to the front and making them more visible, and encouraging MBA students to think about their stories and how they want to shape them, moving on past Darden.
Yeah, what is it like to teach a leadership communication class to MBA students? How do you approach that?
It's amazing. I am getting really excited to meet the first years, and I think that we team teach our required core courses, and our course head Brian Moriarty is amazing, and we do a really impactful assignment at the beginning of the class, which is each student has to come to the front of the room and tell a story about themselves for 5 minutes, about their values in action, what that led them to Darden, who they are. They can choose what they want it to be, but it's obviously both a vulnerable, exercise, but one that creates trust among the students, especially because they're in a smaller class size. So they've been split from their normal class of 70 into 35. And it's so amazing to hear all about, where students come from, what motivates them, what their dreams are, what experiences have shaped them. And I think that the students really remember that moving on as a way that they got to know their peers on a different level. And it just really creates an environment of trust and respect for each other as we move throughout the course, and some of the other assignments regarding more, presentations in business environments and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that is like where you start the class, because obviously the students have been in the program you mentioned is the Q2 class, so they've been going through coursework and they've had some opportunity to speak in class, but not quite the same thing as standing up at the front of the class, giving a 5-minute talk about an experience you had, your values, these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's really, I would say, nothing more challenging, and so obviously some students feel a lot more fear and sort of hesitation about it than others. But I have to say, I feel like most students I know feel like that it's such a big reward when they do it, because especially if they are, more introverted or haven't been prone to speaking in class, it honestly kind of pushes them into the deep end. And then, just giving comments in class seems like, really easy compared to having to go in the front and talk about yourself. And I would have to say that one thing I love about Darden is just how respectful students are to each other. So I've never once had to, tell students to pay attention or put down their phones. I mean, it's obviously an assignment where, an active listening and engagement is really important, for the storyteller. And that just seems to be intuitive, to our students, which, I think it says a lot about our culture and who chooses to join it.
Well, Allison, I mentioned we were talking about your electives, but I want to talk about a book you recently published called The Rise of Corporate Feminism. Where did the inspiration for this book come from?
Yeah, this book, really kind of emerged during my, graduate school years and writing my dissertation and doing research for that. And simultaneously, while I was researching, women's sort of place in the office in the United States and what kind of work women had done historically in businesses, the book Lean In, by Sheryl Sandberg, made such a big impact, just in broader society. And I would have to say that the sort of idea of the book is thinking about tracing the roots of corporate feminism, or what I would call kind of a lean in kind of feminism, or, thinking about, leadership development of women. And so the book really traces where women sort of came from, what obstacles they faced, and, what feminism was able to offer, and also where we still, have a ways to go and are still working to create a most equitable and inclusive environment for everyone.
What was the most surprising thing you discovered as you were working on this book?
It was so fun. This book was based on archival evidence. So, going into boxes of papers and looking at things, as well as a lot of interviews with women who, came of age during this period. And I would have to say, probably the most surprising and fun stuff that I really enjoyed researching was I was up at Smith College in their archives, and I came across a box of letters, unpublished letters to the editor of Working Woman magazine, which was sort of the first magazine geared towards professional women and giving them advice. And you could think about it in a way as a precursor to Lean In, or the sort of abundance of books we now have, and articles about, how women should act and behave in the workplace. And these unpublished letters were just so jarring to me, because they were all from women who felt like the magazine did not speak to them. And they were these letters, saying like, well, I work as a receptionist at a business, and I consider myself, a professional woman, but I feel like the articles, in your magazine, are geared more towards women who are, aspiring to be executives. And that's not something that, I'm able to do right now with, the demands I have for my family, or things like this. And I felt like it was this moment where women's voices that might have been lost, and people might not have ever read, or these obviously were not published. I was able to bring those into the book and, have them be published and have these voices kind of live on, so that we kind of understand the complicated situation of the emergence of women into the C-suite, and how other women, how that made other women feel to have that sort of happening, but feel like they couldn't figure out how to get there or do it, because of a number of different constraints they might have faced.
So what would, for you, I mean, there's undoubtedly many takeaways from your book, but what stands out to you as you think about the book and like maybe one of the key takeaways?
I think one of the key takeaways is for, women who have the privilege to aspire to executive positions or, reach the C-suite, to remember the sort of constraints that a lot of other women face, that they're, either not able to finish college degrees, they have responsibilities with family or children that might take precedence over, being able to pursue professional ambitions. And so I'm really delighted that actually when I teach my elective to the second year students, I don't even have to say that, or talk about that. They sort of naturally bring inequality, and economic inequality and social inequality into the conversation in ways. For example, we had a group of students give a final presentation on fertility benefits, the sort of rise of companies offering fertility benefits to professional women to try to attract, women and kind of help pay for these or defray the cost. And this group focused, without my nudging at all, on what this meant for a lot of who was left out, basically, of this privilege, and the fact that to get these benefits, you had to be working for certain highly esteemed companies and be in these sort of professional roles, and also have a formal employment contract. So if you were a contract worker or contingent worker, that's not going to be you don't have that kind of medical coverage. And so so those were all things that our students are such critical big world thinkers and think about social problems so much that being at Darden is such a great fit for seeing that come to life, because Darden students really have ambitions to be really good people. At UVA we say great and good. So Darden students really want to be good, not just great individually at something.
So I'm curious, folks spend some time on your faculty profile. They'll notice that your areas of expertise include gender and social movements. And I wonder what attracted you to these areas.
Really growing up in Roanoke, I grew up in a sort of traditional suburban, community, and was privileged enough that my mother, stayed at home and raised 4 kids. My father worked as a physician, and I had, it was a great upbringing. I had a lot of amazing opportunities, but it was also one where it was a little bit out of the ordinary, for the friend, my friends' moms to have jobs, and or at least to have kind of a professional career, so to speak. And I just became really interested in looking, even as a child. When I was 13, I remember my parents sort of said, okay, now you can start babysitting for the neighbors, and you're gonna start earning your own money. And I remember I was really the worst babysitter. I was not a good babysitter. I also just sort of encountered some situations where I, just was unprepared to handle it. And the other thing happening was my older brother was mowing yards in the neighborhood instead. And I said to my parents, why can't I would rather mow yards? I don't want to babysit. And my brother's actually making twice the money I am, being a babysitter. And, my parents are fairly conservative, and that, really wasn't something that they wanted to advance. But it was something, kind of just small experiences like that during my upbringing, I think made me start to question, why we have certain assumptions about what type of work, men and women should do, and how it's valued, in a capitalist society.
And how'd you get interested in social movements? Was there an actualizing experience that you had?
Not so much. I think it was just being interested in these great moments of change. And maybe they're not even worth calling moments because it takes a long time, for big social changes to happen and social norms. But as I started to study women's participation in the economy and the type of work women have been doing for decades and centuries, I just became interested in those moments where there were shifts. And I think that that's what led me to study feminism at first. And more recently, I am interested in more recent, you could say, social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and movements that maybe take place just as much on social media, as sort of in as much as collective bodies coming together, but people sort of organizing on social media.
I want to talk about your electives now, and I'd like to start by talking about negotiations. I know this is a class you taught also in the executive MBA program, which is always interesting to me as somebody who leads recruitment for our professional degree programs. But what do you enjoy about teaching negotiations?
I love teaching negotiations because we learn by doing. And I think what I love about it is that in some ways it's a really challenging class to teach because you have people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds or, comfort levels with negotiating. There's people who, especially in the executive MBA program, have been negotiating contracts, maybe large government contracts for many years. And then you get people who don't really feel like they have taken place, or been a part of negotiations much at all. And I think that part of the joy of the class is that even the people who think that they know how to do it, just the sort of practice and the types of exercises we do and the way the class builds on itself, and sort of the learnings from previous negotiations sort of play into the next week. I think, students really come away with something, whether that's a huge jump or kind of just being able to examine their tendencies. It's also a very self-reflective class. So I tell students that you're going to get out of it what you put into it. And a lot of it is, examining your own tendencies and, how you tend to, go through the negotiation process. So we do a lot of work on, we have an assignment that's a personal goal statement. We, give feedback to each other, formally after the negotiation. We analyze, a negotiation experience in the class as our final paper. And so students are really able to customize the course and the content to really speak to the questions they have about themselves as negotiators.
Yeah, I always enjoy seeing students engaged in that class because you see little groups of them all going through a negotiation. I've even been able to participate in one of these negotiations. I think they were probably short a volunteer to be right back to law school. It was great.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. I remember that. And obviously, it's more fun to learn by doing. And so what better way to learn negotiation than to just do exercises and then get back together and talk about them. And so most students really enjoy the class and enjoy the experiential learning.
Well, let's also talk about your elective that you mentioned here a couple times, women, gender, and work. I'm always curious, where does the inspiration for a class come from? So how did you decide that this was a class that you wanted to offer?
Yeah, at past institutions, I've taught classes that were titled Women in Leadership. And I debated, when I was designing the selective and forwarding it to the curriculum committee, I sort of debated what I was going to call it, and I decided I wanted to include both women and gender in the title, with the reason being that the protagonists of a lot of our cases are do identify as women, and where those sorts of stories are less common in business schools. So I did want to make sure it was about women and not just gender. But with that said, obviously you can't talk about women without talking about, gender, as a category of analysis. And so I sort of wanted both in the title to say, we are going to elevate the stories of women, and promote women in what they do in the workplace. But this course is obviously also about gender. And we do have a case about someone who, we have a masculinity case about someone who identifies as male. And I decided I wanted to make it about work instead of leadership. And part of that was just a desire to, broaden the discussion of leadership to include people who don't necessarily think they're leaders. So we have cases of people who aren't necessarily managing other people. We also the second half of the course is tailored towards skills building. And so we do different exercises on networking and, shaping one's career. And so I wanted, it to be both about work that's paid, but also, other roles people have and other identities as, family members, parents, siblings, other things that are important to people.
It sounds super interesting. It's interesting to hear you kind of make the distinction between work and leadership. When I think about reading a case about a leader, my mind immediately goes to someone in the C-suite, whereas like work feels much more inclusive, could be a lot of different things, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be just corporate context.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. That's kind of was my motivation, was to just think more broadly about, all the types of work that are happening in the economy that are paid for and not paid for. And so I thought, well, I'll try calling it, having work in the title, and, maybe revisit it as leadership. But I also didn't want it to appear to be a prescriptive class for women only, like here's what you need to do to be a leader. And we do have men in the class. And so I wanted it to just be more broadly about work and how people are sorted into work and the opportunities they have at work.
I know this class was very, very popular with students. It was rated in the top 10% of Darden electives, and that's a tremendous congratulations on that. What do you enjoy about teaching this course?
I love this course. I mean, I spend so much time on it because it's just, my personal and professional passions coming together. Maybe one of my favorite things about the course is that the final project of the course is for students to interview an alum. And so I spend a lot of time working on pairing students with an alum, and we survey alums and sort of get their industry experience and jobs they've had, and we try to, and sort of what they've done at Darden too, what clubs or interests they had at Darden, and then I try to pair each student based on their own bio and demographics with an alum. And it's really rewarding for the students to come up to me and say, I had the best, conversation with this person, and we're going to stay in touch. And, I learned so much talking to them, and they were so candid with me. And I feel like there's no better way to leverage, the Darden network and the Darden community than, bring alums back into the classroom to help talk to, our students and share their experiences after, they've left Darden.
What's the nature of that conversation? Are they asking questions that are informed by a particular lens, or is it just tell me about your career? Or?
Yeah, great question. So as a class, we come up with, I would say, kind of an interview guide loosely. So we kind of, I have the students sort of come into the conversation, with some questions in mind. But with that said, I tell students to, research their person, and, obviously feel free to pose unique questions to them. and and also to go off script, so to speak, which I'm sure you know about from running a successful podcast. You kind of come in with kind of questions you want to target, but if something comes up that is a bit off of the guide, you're excited to explore that too. And it's both personal and professional questions. And a lot of times women really, our alums are pretty eager to share, choices they've made or ways that they have navigated, work and family. And so that does end up being, a chunk of the conversation and pretty prominent in most of the interviews. And then students end up writing a reflective case study about their experience that features the person that they talk to.
One of the things we try to do here on the podcast is kind of bring people a little bit into the classroom, talk about maybe a case that you really enjoy from this class. Is there one that comes to mind that you think people might be interested in hearing about here?
Yeah, I wrote this case. It's actually still in draft form being edited, but I came across just some really interesting articles about Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court justice, and she is very open about her background and sort of how her coming of age experiences have shaped her and her professional journey. And while I was not able to interview her, I decided I wanted to write a publicly sourced case about her and about sort of what motivated her. And then the case examines to what extent she should bring herself and her values into the congressional hearings. She faces some tough choices because of the scrutiny about her, quote, wise Latina comment. And, she knows the case kind of ends that she knows she's going to be asked by a lot of Congress people about the comment. And, it was perceived in some ways as inappropriate. And sort of how should she defend it? Should she try to explain it? Should she distance herself from it? So a lot of it was about the case really brings up an interesting conversation in class about, when people feel like they can share their identity, and then when people feel like they might need to scale back. And we sort of talk about it over the course of a career. And then we sort of look at how she, talks about the comments after she is confirmed as Supreme Court justice. And we talk about how, maybe throughout the course of the career, you have different approaches to deploying your identity or how you manage your identity at work. And, we talk about, what people think about that and, what is their plan. And so I feel like I really like that case because I just like the story, and it's interesting to students to get to, think about what she said and watch videos of her. But it also allows them to ask big questions about their own life and, think about what they're wanting to do in the future.
Well, how do you see this course fitting into a student's MBA experience? Obviously, it comes in the second year, students are taking electives. But beyond that, how do you see this fitting within the broader sort of MBA program for students?
Yeah, I would call it, I think it's a course that pushes students to think about their own stories, both stories of like what led them to Darden and what has shaped them and their values and their professional interests, and as well as the course tries to give them tools to further craft their careers after Darden, and to think about where they want to be. One of the quotes we talk about is, you need to sort of figure out your own story, lest someone else kind of shape it for you. And so there are sort of broader norms or, kind of tendencies of, maybe going in one direction or another. And you have to be very aware and cognizant of what you want to be able to try to take, have agency and take control of shaping your story, your broader life story.
So last thing, what's your favorite thing about Darden? What do you enjoy about the school community?
Oh, I love the students. I love that the students are at Darden to learn and engage and learn from each other. And they're open to, personal growth and learning about themselves. And it's just really just the best place to get to teach, with students who are really committed to the academics, want to do more reading, like I have, these long lists of recommended readings for my women and gender class. And, students love that, students tell me, oh, I read this. And just the intellectual exchange that happens in the Darden classroom and outside of the Darden classroom seems beyond compare to me. And I love getting to be a part of that community and be part of that, intellectual discourse.
Well, Allison, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about your elective and share your story with our listeners.
Thanks so much for having me, Brett.
And that was my interview with Allison Elias, an assistant professor of business administration and member of the communication faculty area here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.